Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. My name is LYNETTE. I'm a professor of political science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at the University of Toronto. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And I'm very honored here today to be hosting this webinar to discuss Professor Susan SHIRK's latest book, Overreach. Now, let me take a minute to introduce Professor SHIRK. She is a research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center. She's one of the most influential experts working on US-China relations and Chinese politics. Susan first visited China in 1971 and has been teaching, researching, and engaging China diplomatically ever since. Susan has also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Clinton administration. Now she is the author of various books, including China, Fragile Superpower, The Political Logic of Economic Reform in China, How China Opened Its Door, Competitive Comrades, and an edited book volume, Changing Media, Changing China. Now I can tell you that I have assigned at least 2 of the books that I have mentioned in my classes on Chinese politics. But we are here today really to talk about and really to celebrate her latest book, Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. So with that introduction, I'll pass it over to Professor SHIRK.
Well, thanks so much, LYNETTE, for inviting me to speak about my book with you today. It's really a great privilege to be with you in Toronto. I wish it were in person, but it's nice to see you virtually. As you said, I am an old China hand. Let me just see if I can make my PowerPoint go. Let's see. There we go. Here you'll see a picture of me with Zhou Enlai in 1971. I always put it up because I'm so proud of it, and it was such an exciting occasion. I was also, that was great luck to be able to go to China right after the US ping pong team. I also had a lot of luck in having the opportunity to serve in government and work with Madeleine Albright. And for most of my career, China has been a positive story. Relations between China and the world, including the US, were getting better and better, and Chinese people's lives were improving as well. China's leaders pursued a strategy of self-restraint to reassure other countries that it wasn't a threat despite its growing capabilities. And then here's that exciting moment when I was there in Beijing as Bill Clinton addressed the students at Beida. But then things changed in the mid-2000s, before the Olympics and before the global financial crisis. China started asserting its maritime claims in the South China Sea, started tightening up social control, Weiwen, stability maintenance in China, control over the media, internet, society, and economy. And what was puzzling to me was that this occurred during Hu Jintao's collective leadership. And if you read my book, you'll understand that surprising history. But today, I am going to be speaking mostly about overreach under Xi Jinping, because that's the situation we have today, and that's China's future, based on our expectations for the upcoming Party Congress. So, but at the end of the collective leadership of Hu Jintao, you'll see that despite the tightening up and the overreach that started during Hu Jintao, at the end of that era, there was an open split in the leadership, and there was a crisis over the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands at the end of the Hu Jintao decade. Remember that Xi Jinping was already the anointed the anointed successor and about to take the throne. So what happened is some of these problems, including rampant corruption in the Hu Jintao collective leadership, provided the opportunity for Xi Jinping to make the case that China needed a more concentrated leadership and that collective leadership was problematic. So, but of course, the party elite got a more personalistic dictatorial leader than they had anticipated in Xi Jinping. For example, here, compare the front page in 2012 as Xi Jinping, as the anointed successor, took over, and you see that his picture is about the same size as the other members in the collective leadership. But by 5 years later, we see that Xi Jinping dominates the front page of the newspaper and indeed dominates Chinese political system. Today, here's a picture of the 19th Party Congress. Today, on the eve of the 20th Party Congress, it's a really important moment for us to step back and assess Xi Jinping's decade in power and to speculate a little bit about his third term. As you all know, I'm sure, the Party Congress that meets every 5 years is scheduled to open October 16th. And based on past precedent, when Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao retired after serving 2 terms in office, Xi Jinping should be really retiring now. But instead, he's almost certainly going to be awarded a third term. So what he's effectively doing is tearing up the norm of this peaceful, predictable turnover of top leadership, which really was a remarkable accomplishment that China achieved. Other communist countries had not achieved it. And it certainly improves the resilience of a communist regime to have the predictability of the retirement cycle and succession cycle of top leadership. But now, in the case of Xi Jinping, not only is he almost certainly going to have a third term, but no successor has yet been identified. When Xi pushed through the constitutional revision that got rid of the 2-term limit for the presidency, effectively also eliminating the 2-term limit for the general secretary of the party, which is really the top position in Chinese politics. There was significant concern on the part of the Chinese elite. And when I interviewed about this with party insiders, I've never heard as sharp criticism of a Chinese leader as I heard about Xi Jinping. So what one word might sum up the Xi Jinping decade? You won't be surprised that I suggest overreach. Overreach means taking things too far, doing things in an exaggerated manner that ends up being costly to oneself. It's self-defeating, counterproductive action, harming China's own interests. The costs of Xi's overreaching are piling up and dragging down the economy and sparking a strong international backlash against China. So what I'd like to do today is just very quickly summarize the main examples of overreach in both foreign policy and domestic policy under Xi Jinping, and then open up the black box of Chinese politics, which is something I've done primarily through interviewing in China, to explain what is driving this overreach. And then I hope to have time to offer a few suggestions on how the US should respond and avoid itself overreacting to China's overreaching. Well, first on foreign policy, Xi Jinping dusted off plans that had been on the shelf for years to build large artificial islands in the South China Sea on top of the rocks it controlled and fortify them with military installations, despite a pledge to President Barack Obama not to militarize them. Also, in the South China Sea, bullying its Southeast Asian neighbors, who themselves have, under international law, have claims to the coastal waters and islands and rocks within those waters. And here you see China's fishing militia, maritime militia, together with its Coast Guard, lashed together at Whitsun Reef, also claimed by the Philippines, lingering there for weeks to establish China's claim and block Filipino fishermen from fishing there. Under Xi Jinping, and of course, this has really alarmed not just the Southeast Asian countries, but also other countries. It's fueled a narrative of China as a menacing threat rather than a responsible power. Also, China has intensified its Coast Guard and naval and air force pressure against Japan and Taiwan, with Xi Jinping at the helm. He has taken a new role as operational commander of the Joint Battle Command, as well as heading the Central Military Commission. He established an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea over Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in 2013. And he's been flying over the midline in the Taiwan Strait quite frequently, as well as having the Navy sail around the islands of Japan and Taiwan. Recently, after Speaker Pelosi's visit, they surrounded Taiwan with military exercises to show China's ability to completely control or blockade the island. Also, in the early days of the Biden administration, when there might have been an opportunity for a reset with the United States, China picked a number of fights, including a border fight with India, in which it produced significant loss of life between 20 and 40 killed on each side. So by picking fights, of course, at that time with Japan, with Taiwan, of course, with India, with Australia, it provoked even and hardened the position of the Biden administration. It would have been a moment of possible reassurance and stabilization of relations, but the Chinese policymakers did not take advantage of it. Another form of overreach is using access to China's huge market to intimidate other countries as well as businesses and pressure them to conform with Chinese positions on mostly what are domestic issues: Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, etc. Boycotted Korean products after Japan installed a THAAD missile defense battery from the United States, cut off imports with Australia when Australian government proposed an international investigation on the origins of the COVID epidemic. Even talking about investigating the origins of COVID had become for Xi's regime a core interest. And here you see the decline in Australian exports to China. At the end of Xi's first term, he started to define the relationship between China and the West as an ideological contest and talk about the superiority of China's system. And the result of that is that the Trump and then the Biden administration started pushing back and framing the relations with China as effectively a Cold War in which the Americans are also vilifying China's party autocracy. The Belt and Road Initiative. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to mention the wolf warrior diplomacy, of course, which is a bit of an oxymoron because diplomats are supposed to try to improve relations with other countries. But Chinese diplomats started using Twitter and making speeches in which they used threatening and bellicose language. And here's one of the best known wolf warriors, Zhao Lijian, who from his position in Pakistan started attacking the West and especially the United States in various ways, and Australia, and got a promotion to go to Beijing and become the foreign ministry spokesman. Belt and Road Initiative, a kind of grand scheme of Xi Jinping's to link China all the way to Europe with infrastructure projects and China giving loans to countries to build closer relations with China. That has now left China struggling to collect repayment for these loans. One of the most dramatic forms of overreach under Xi Jinping has been the destruction of Hong Kong's political freedoms by the sudden imposition of the national security law in 2020, which violated the Chinese agreement and commitment to a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong for 50 years. Now there's a PRC security agency answering directly to the party and with the authority to investigate cases and try them on the mainland based in Hong Kong. The dean of the University of Hong Kong Law School was quoted as saying, never in his wildest imagination would he have thought that there would be a PRC security agency in Hong Kong answering directly to the party. Basically, what Xi Jinping did is have Beijing take over Hong Kong. Finally, Xi Jinping's close friendship with Putin and his choice to align with Russia, pledging friendship without limit to him on the eve of his brutal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, has definitely strengthened or increased China's international isolation. Putin probably misled him, and the United States provided intelligence to him about Putin's actual plans, but he still chose to lean toward Russia, although China is not offering tangible military assistance to Russia. So all of these actions have led to a strong global backlash against a China threat. Governments and businesses are trying to reduce their economic reliance on China. As the German economic minister said recently, we cannot allow ourselves to be blackmailed by China. So China's coercion, China's overreaching has deeply harmed its relations with Europe. The European Union was about to sign a bilateral investment and trade treaty when Beijing sanctioned members of the European legislature, which of course caused the Europeans to break off negotiations for that treaty. And we hear investors, international investors and multinational companies that in the past were always very bullish on prospects for China are now much more worried about political risk than ever before and starting to diversify away from China. And we see in Asia defense coalitions being built to balance against China, deter China from any possible military aggression, which looks more likely to other countries now. Here's the Quad, also AUKUS, UK and the US joining forces to help Australia acquire nuclear submarines. And here we see Western navies, here are the French, joining the US in Taiwan Strait transits and also sailing in the South China Sea. And probably the most significant change is that Japan now defines the defense of Taiwan as essential to its overall national security. Domestic overreach, I think these instances are well known to most of you. The re-education, thought reform camps for Muslims in Xinjiang, which is really at the extreme end of the social control intensification in China, but not the only one. A lot of use of new surveillance technologies, AI technologies, as well as continued use of Mao-era mutual supervision by Chinese citizens of one another in their neighborhoods, work units, schools, to watch over, keep control of one another. So China has become more of a police state, but one that is policed by the party and its own citizens, as well as the professional police. The crackdown on the media and internet after more than a decade of quite a lively, relatively open Chinese commercialized media and internet, going up through the Hu era, involves censorship so that the media, the contents of the media is now much more uniform, homogeneous, and looks more like propaganda. And here you see an app, an ideological education app, in which Chinese citizens are, especially party members, are required to download the app, take lessons in Xi Jinping's ideas, take tests, and often their work supervisors check up on their homework to make sure that they've carried out their ideological education. The state is also pouring billions of dollars into technological self-reliance for national security. This is, of course, extremely wasteful, and it has driven the United States and other countries to accelerate their decoupling from China. One of the most self-destructive things that Xi Jinping did during this last term was the sudden unanticipated crackdown on private business in the summer of 2021 in the name of security and loyalty to the party. The thunderclap was the decision reportedly made by Xi himself to block the $34 billion IPO of Ant Group, which is a part of Alibaba, just 2 days before Ant was set to go public on the Shanghai and Hong Kong exchanges, wiping out billions of dollars of equity value of shareholders and imposing new restrictions on not just Ant, but other internet platform companies as well, and blocking their IPOs and forcing them to lay off workers. As a consequence, China is surprisingly suffering youth unemployment right now. 20% of youth who have graduated from college are unemployed, which is, of course, potentially a risky thing for party rule, because college graduates, discontented college graduates, as we've seen in many other countries, can be or have the ability to organize collective action against the government. In this crackdown on the private sector, it ended up effectively not forcing, but motivating many Chinese entrepreneurs to resign their positions. And, because they saw that instead of letting the market drive the economy, Xi Jinping was putting the party smack dab in the middle of it. And the motivation for this crackdown on private business, which is really pretty mystifying considering how it's harmed China's own economy, is to prevent private economies from becoming alternative power centers who could challenge Xi Jinping's rule. Finally, probably the decision which has been most difficult for China is Xi Jinping's stubborn persistence in zero COVID management of the disease. Xi had claimed China's management of COVID as proof of the superiority of its socialist system during the days when the US was failing at its messy, decentralized management of the disease. And so he's reluctant to admit that zero COVID is not the best answer now, despite the fact that circumstances have changed. Omicron is a more contagious but less severe form of the disease, and yet Xi has refused to adapt his method of management. I think that there may be another reason he's so insistent in clinging to the zero COVID approach, which is that at the beginning of COVID, not only did local governments in Wuhan and Hebei institute a kind of cover-up, which was harmful to ordinary people because they were not aware of the risk of contagion, but also the central government may have been at least partially responsible, and Xi may still feel politically vulnerable about that. He himself has said in an article that he issued demands to the Standing Committee on January 7th and has been completely in charge since then. And yet it wasn't until January 20th in which they informed the public about the contagiousness of the disease. So that suggests that the central government was complicit in the information cover-up, and Xi may still feel some sense of political vulnerability over that. But in any case, as recently as this May, he doubled down on zero COVID, insisting that it be continued, and he got the Standing Committee to Biao to take a stand behind him, declaring that anyone who questions zero COVID is disloyal to the party. So it's become a symbol rather than a practical solution to the problem of the epidemic. So why all this overreaching? And here I'd like to provide an explanation by opening up the black box of Chinese politics and suggesting that the type of system that Xi has created, it's personalistic, highly centralized, and more dictatorial political institutions are largely responsible for overreach under Xi Jinping. After Mao died, Deng Xiaoping tried to make sure that China would never have another Mao. He identified the problem of the Mao era as over-concentration of power, and said that that type of system with over-concentration of power is likely to give rise to arbitrary decision-making, like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So this frank analysis by Deng Xiaoping set the stage for a long period of trying to institutionalize collective leadership. And yet we see that under Xi Jinping, it was relatively easy for him to turn things around, make a U-turn back to a centralized, personalistic leadership system in which was inevitably going to lead to arbitrary decisions and overreaching in a way that would be very costly to China. And I think, you know, although Deng Xiaoping is kind of my hero, he can be criticized for not going far enough in de-Maoization. And he never allowed the growth of any political institutions outside the party to check the actions of politicians, party politicians. So he did help strengthen the collective institutions within the party, like the Central Committee, but he never allowed the legislature or the courts to establish independent authority. So although Chinese politics became more predictable and institutionalized with term limits, retirement ages, regular meetings of party institutions, it turned out to be relatively easy for Xi Jinping to concentrate power. And now we see the overreach that is the consequence of that. Xi took over direct control of the police and the military, as well as the party is leading pretty much all the policy process, including on the economy, which is typically and traditionally in the past was delegated to the State Council and the Prime Minister. Even within the Standing Committee of the party, other 6 leaders have been advised by Xi not to disagree with him in meetings. And really, there's no political counterweight who can question the strategic myths that the leader believes in about how the West is plotting against China. So in this type of system, it's really no surprise that Xi Jinping started out his reign with a massive anti-corruption campaign. Of course, corruption had become a very serious problem, but this campaign, which in fact has grown over time, over the past decade, is putting tremendous fear in the hearts of the Chinese political elite. It's effectively a purge against Xi Jinping's potential rivals. And it's not just about corruption. Xi Jinping himself identified how senior leaders had been plotting against him and to split the party. Most notably, Zhou Yongkang, the former security czar, and Bo Xilai, the party secretary of Chongqing. The purge now is in its 3rd wave, and just recently, the 3rd wave is actually aimed at the security and disciplinary bureaucracies, the police, and the party disciplinary bureaucracy. So these people are the inquisitors who actually carried out Xi Jinping's earlier purge, earlier in his time in office, and now Xi has turned against them and is purging them. This is what Zbigniew Brzezinski called, in talking about the Soviet Union, a permanent purge. No sign that it will end. And the consequence of that, when you have this high pressure situation in which the anti-corruption discipline purge might go after you if Xi Jinping thinks you are disloyal, what happens? All subordinates work very hard to prove their loyalty to Xi Jinping. You do that by praising Xi in every sentence, as Yang Jiechi, the head of the Foreign Affairs Office of the party, does in his speeches, and how Wang Yi, who used to be one of the most creative and thoughtful diplomats in China, I know him quite well and really admire his leadership in China's Asia policy in an earlier era, his negotiations with Japan, negotiations with Taiwan, but now he simply repeats and in fact often takes perhaps even further than she would want it, Xi Jinping's ambitious perspective on the world. So the problem with this type of centralized personalistic system is that subordinates bandwagon on the positions of the leaders, competing with one another to further their own careers, and do it by getting out in front in declaring their loyalty to Xi Jinping by taking his policies even further than he might have originally envisioned. This is what overreach in this type of system amounts to. This bandwagoning dynamic, we see it also in the crackdown on the private sector. We certainly see it in how local officials are carrying out zero COVID. And in fact, when you look at how local officials are over complying on the zero COVID policy, it looks depressingly like the actions of local officials in Mao's Great Leap Forward. So the dynamic is very much of costly overcompliance of subordinate officials is very much the same. So, you know, a Leninist party leader who doesn't share power and patronage with other leaders is bound to frustrate other politicians, especially if there's no end to the monopoly in sight. As a result, Xi Jinping's third term is likely to see continued overreach, maybe more overreach, because he's demonstrated his power by claiming a third term. The information feedback loops will continue not to work. I mean, that's another dimension of personalistic centralized leadership, is that subordinates don't dare to tell the truth about the actual costs of Xi's policies. So they're over complying and they're not providing accurate information up the chain, just as we saw in the tragic Great Leap Forward. So let me conclude now with a couple of thoughts about US policy. Or Lynette, should we cover that in the discussion perhaps and have me conclude my talk now?
Right, you can take another couple of minutes to talk about policy implications if you like. We can also discuss that over Q&A if you like.
Okay. The Biden administration came into office intending to revise the Trump administration's confrontational strategy toward China, but it finds itself perpetuating it instead, using competition with China as a foil to try to win bipartisan support for its legislative agenda of self-renewal. Having heard both Democrat and Republican administrations inveighing against China, the public naturally has become more suspicious of it. Here you see, according to Pew Research polls, 8 in 10 Americans are now negative toward China. That was only 4 in 10 before Xi Jinping took power. Anti-China attitudes have become the new bipartisan axis of American politics. And, you know, bipartisan consensus isn't always a good thing. The bipartisan consensus on anti-China is making it difficult, I would argue, for policymakers to think sensibly about the cost-benefit trade-offs of their policies. I mean, when the Biden administration describes China as our greatest threat, even though Russia invaded Ukraine, a sovereign nation, and China hasn't done that, to me, that's a form of overreaction that we should seek to avoid. Security considerations are blinding us to the costs of the walls we are building in an effort to decouple from China. Restrictions to reduce our interdependence on China are harming America's own competitiveness. Of course, we need to prevent serious espionage and threats to American national security, but there are discrete solutions to managing security risks, just like we manage cybersecurity. And then I believe we should let the natural immune system of a well-functioning, open, pluralist society and market economy deal with the challenging China. Unfortunately, the United States is competing with China by becoming more like China, nationalist, fixated on security, and politicizing its own market economy, instead of becoming a better version of itself. I believe that the secret of American success has always been its openness. Openness assures a flow of global talents to our world-class universities. Many of those talented people will stay to build companies and make discoveries. As a result of the hostile relationship between the US and China and the restrictions that the US government has put on, a cloud hangs over Chinese and Chinese American scientists and engineers, so much so that some of them are accepting positions in China or moving to Canada. Canada is not very far away, and I think some US restrictions are encouraging people, scientists and engineers, to move to Canada. They see that there's anti-Asian American sentiment in the United States has grown along with the anti-China sentiment. So, and finally, So I believe we should be a lot more cautious about the walls we're building, and we should preserve the openness of our own society and our own market economy. Finally, I would urge the Biden administration after the midterm, don't give up on diplomacy. Make a new effort to talk to Beijing. I'm not sure whether or not it'll work. I'm actually pretty agnostic about whether or not we can influence Xi Jinping's decision calculus to moderate his own overreaching. But I believe we need to test the proposition by pursuing smart diplomacy. And we haven't really engaged in traditional diplomacy with China for 6 years. So, and that's because many Americans have just given up on China, think it's become our adversary, and we need to degrade and defeat it. I believe we need to test that by trying harder to engage in diplomacy. And if it doesn't work, we'll have new information, and that will enable us to update and revise our strategy toward China. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to your questions, Lynette, and for a good discussion with our audience.
Right. Thank you so much, Susan, for that really illuminating presentation. Some thoughts. I think to me this is an important book because you have provided a very thick description and a detailed explanation for the structural shift that we are seeing from China in the last 10, 15 years or so. So back in 2003, Zheng Zijian proposed the idea of a peaceful rise, and I think you have gone to great lengths to explain how that has been derailed. So the structural shift is that China has always see itself, and then in rhetoric as well, saying that it's a responsible power. But I think of late, the sort of propaganda coming out from Beijing is that we need to work on, this is our time to shine, great rejuvenation, that sort of rhetoric. I think your book is important in explaining how China has shifted from one of responsible rising power to become one of revisionist power. I particularly like the idea and intrigued about your idea of bandwagoning and how that is actually central to a regime that is becoming more personalistic. So this overzealous and over compliance to policies and overzealous implementation by officials at the grassroots level and at various levels of government, because they are fearful of not doing enough. So to err on the side of caution, they overdo it, and that result in the consequence of overreach. And I think several things that you have said really resonate with Canadian audience here. Canada, like many countries around the world, has also been a victim of bullying tactics by China, starting with the arrest of the two Michaels, boycott of Canadian canola oil and pork exports to China. Anti-China sentiment has also risen in Canada quite dramatically over the last couple of years, and this is very much in line of the trend that we have seen across the world. But I also take heed and I take notice of the policy lesson that you provided at the end, which is foreign diplomacy is really not a zero-sum game, right? We shouldn't see the competition, East versus West, as that of a zero-sum relationship. There should be a way to figure out for China as well as the rest of the world to advance without hurting each other. I would like to pose a couple of questions for you and the audience to think about. One is, so you started off with explanation in the Xi Jinping's period, and I think you did not have time to go back to what happened during the Hu Jintao's period. But in your book, you actually talk about Hu Jintao's relatively weak leadership and how he has allowed for coalitional politics in the armed forces, security agents, and propaganda to take advantage of that. So they kind of exaggerate the threats of internal stability and color revolution, and how that has actually sparked the fire and provoked belligerent policies. Can you speak a little bit to that? And I also wonder about competing explanations. So I think what you have emphasized is a combination of kind of institutional factor as well as agency. I wonder to what extent this is an ideological warfare and that of an institutional determinism, which is in an autocratic system where there's a lack of check and balances, lack of the rule of law. Ultimately, they will be overzealous of implementation. Ultimately, they will be over compliance. So the system is kind of deterministic in a way that it doesn't matter whoever is in power. At the end, it is not sustainable without the institutional, checks and balances. And I also wonder to what extent this is a bit of an ideologically defined competition, as Evan Medeiros has put it recently, between China and the West, which is that no matter whether it's Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, or whoever is in power, ideologically, we will see a clash between China and the West because of the nature of its very system. And I also wonder about implications of your thesis about overreach. For you have spoken about the policy implications for the United States, but what about the Indo-Pacific strategy? Canada, the Canadian government, like Biden administration, has been talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, which China is at the front and center of that. We don't know how to effectively deal with China, so we talk about Indo-Pacific strategy, about encircling China from its surrounding. What do you think, overreach, what does it imply for how a country like Canada should deal with China and should position itself within the region? And lastly, what do you think are the implications for regime stability with the party congress coming up next week in 10 days or so? What does it tell us about regime durability? I will leave it here, and we have about half an hour. So we have a couple of questions here. So Susan, do you want to take a couple of minutes to respond, or we can start taking the questions from the floor?
Well, you raised a lot of interesting questions, Lynette, and I probably can't address all of them, but maybe I should just say a quick bit about the Hu era and overreach under collective rule, because for me as a political scientist, I find this really interesting, and because we usually think of collective leadership, consensus decision making as being a formula for inertia or stasis or moving slowly, not rushing ahead and doing things in an exaggerated way. But what's interesting, and this is an idea that comes from the international relations scholar Jack Snyder in his work on Germany and Japan, that if you've got entrenched bureaucratic interest groups in this type of a collective arrangement, this kind of oligarchic rule, you may get a kind of log rolling, swapping favors among interest groups in a way that nobody checks anybody else. It's not a mutual veto system. I mean, formally it may be, but what happens is the oligarchs in the standing committee, they sort of say to one another, well, you do what you want to do in your domain, and I'll go along with it so long as you go along with what I want to do in my domain. So you get a very incoherent kind of outcome, which can lead to overreach, as it did in the second term of Hu Jintao, especially because the most powerful coalitions were what I call the control coalition, the internal security and propaganda bureaucracies, which under Hu Jintao, their czars were also in the standing committee. And they just ran their own shows and hyped up the threats, domestic threats, in order to get bigger budgets, more influence for their agencies and for themselves. And also the state management of the economy, those institutions also, I think they log rolled with the control coalition quite effectively to have the state, become more active in managing the economy once again after quite a long time of decentralization and the growth of the private sector. So, one really interesting question that Jack Snyder put to me after he read my manuscript is, well, could Hu Jintao have done anything to prevent this overreach, especially in foreign policy in the South China Sea, but also in social control? Could he have saved this peak freedom of information that you had in the first term of Hu Jintao and this relatively free development of civil society that was starting to happen? A lot of good things were happening during that period. And, I think it's definitely the case that there was a coalition behind that continued openness and reform that might have been a counterweight to the control coalition, but who never had found a way to give that group, which probably consists of intellectuals, professionals, journalists, the private businesses, coastal provinces more exposed to the world, growing middle class, I would say, is really part of that group, never found a way to give them a real voice in the party political institutions, despite the fact that Jiang Zemin had done the 3 represents, to try to co-opt these groups into the party, including the private sector, and yet nothing ever really came of it, if you look at the numbers. So there's no voice for these groups, and but we know that a potential coalition like that exists. If you look at the things that Wang Yang, Wen Jiabao were saying, they were appealing to an audience of this kind of reform and opening coalition. But otherwise, why would they be talking that way? And yet there was never a way to build them into a counterweight to the reform, to the control coalition. So that's a really interesting counterfactual, I think, about that earlier period. Regime durability in the third term, I think unless other party elites are able to persuade Xi Jinping to have more power sharing in the third term. And here we need to look and see who's in the standing committee. How many of those slots go to Xi acolytes? How many go to leaders with more independent, factional, and popular bases? You know, Victor Schur and I and our other colleagues at 21st Century China Center, we did a little report on what to expect after the 20th Party Congress that you can find on our website. And we have kind of two scenarios of a more or less constrained Xi Jinping. And if there's a little bit more constrained, then maybe you'll get a more pragmatic, prudent policy, at least in domestic policy, to restore the momentum behind economic development. And that's probably not going to happen. I'd say, based on his track record, I doubt that Xi Jinping is going to welcome that. He's probably going to want to reduce all challenges to himself and have a standing committee that is, completely loyal to him. And if he does that, the risk of more overreach, domestic and international, becomes more acute, for sure. But also the risk of power struggle, because if there's no power sharing, no sharing of patronage, no sharing of in the policymaking process, then the China's political elite, I think, is their frustration and their worries about the future party rule could lead to a real power struggle, even though many of the potential leaders of a resistance movement have been put away by the purge. Remember, all of those, the families of the people who've been purged are also bitter enemies of Xi Jinping's. And so there are a lot of unhappy people in China's elite today. And the risk of power struggle because of the lack of power sharing becomes quite severe. And I'd say the risk of diversionary foreign policy, wag the dog scenarios, provoking fights in order to distract people away from domestic problems, also becomes more severe. So that's pretty bad. And, I'm sure many people would say, well, that's why we really have to go all out to weaken China, because we can't count on its behaving responsibly or prudently. Well, I guess my sense is let's definitely be prepared to deter China militarily, but meanwhile, let's make another stab at testing whether or not we can use diplomacy to try to get Xi Jinping to moderate his policies, because the costs to China of his policies are piling up. So that could motivate him to adjust his policies. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was great. On your point, balance weight reminds me of glass that was very purpose opening up in the society or and how the history of the Soviet Union has. Anyway, so
Lynette, your sound is breaking up a little to me. I don't know if others have the same problem, but
internet. You can hear me, but anyway, you can also see the questions in the Q&A box. It's a question from Ray Rubin. Does this prove that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolute?
Well, I guess yes and no. I mean, I think there is a little bit more to it than that. And that, but it's true that a system, the more concentrated power is at the top. And we, of course, in China, we don't have any bottom-up oversight of local officials through elections or anything else like that. So in this type of hierarchical system, the greater the pressure to prove your loyalty, because the risk of being viewed as disloyal by the leader is so severe. You know, you get this perverse dynamic in which you get overcompliance and you get a lot of inaccurate information about the actual cost to the policy. That's definitely true.
Great. Come from Shen Shu. Do you think the of Russia and Ukraine has an influence on Xi Jinping continuing his aggressive policies and overreaching?
Well, it's a really interesting question. Both what is the future of China's alignment with Russia and what are the lessons that Xi Jinping might be drawing from the poor performance, military performance of Russia in Ukraine. I think that Xi and Putin have established a close personal relationship because they share a common perspective on the world and especially on the West. They both feel that the West is aiming for them and their political systems, and that they are threatened by Western-oriented color revolutions. Their regimes are fragile, their own power is fragile, and it's the West that's their problem. So, I do believe that the Ukraine war is an important moment for the US to look at its own strategy toward China and Russia and to make sure we differentiate between the two and develop an approach which is different rather than just lumping them together as dangerous autocracies, which is really the mistake we made during the US-Soviet Cold War. So I think we should recognize that China is so much more integrated in the global economy and with the United States, that China has not used military force other than at the border with India to actually invade another sovereign country the way Russia has. And we should test whether or not China and Xi Jinping might be induced to moderate their policies and to stabilize relations with other countries if we show some goodwill, communicate, and pursue diplomacy with it.
Okay. From Bill Dole, you have mentioned about cybersecurity becoming an issue. Do you think in the future between China, US, and other Western countries will have a chance to reach certain type of cooperation on fighting against the threat?
Well, I think the potential for cooperation between China and the US in cybersecurity is going to be very, very difficult. The data, but it's conceivable that we could come to some agreements about how we treat data and that dimension of cybersecurity. Certainly, China was kind of at the vanguard of trying to maintain complete control over all of its data. I think it's fair to say that the Europeans were following behind them, mostly from the angle of privacy. And then the United States now is also, being much more aggressive in regulating control of data. So I suppose at some point, what would be desirable is to have global norms about this, global rules that are accepted by all countries.
That's a good question from Deirdre Vincent. How is meeting the of Chinese surveillance of migrant population in other countries, including the United States? This is done to increase the global CCP, and as such, surely some to.
Well, I didn't have time to talk about this, but I certainly see Chinese party policy toward overseas Chinese, ethnic Chinese living in other countries as a form of Xi Jinping overreach. And I have a section in my book on this because previously Chinese leaders have urged Chinese living in other countries to, first of all, be good citizens of the country they live in and not maybe invest in China, maybe elevate the respect for Chinese culture, but nobody has really suggested that you should be loyal sons and daughters of the CCP. But Xi Jinping has shifted overseas Chinese policy from the government over to the Party United Front Department and is definitely seeking to have the overseas Chinese become more of an asset to China's rejuvenation, its political rejuvenation. And that, of course, endangers these folks because people in the country where they're living start believing that they are spies or helping steal intellectual property or otherwise become the handmaidens of the Chinese Communist Party. So in effect, this approach, this overreaching, is actually endangering these folks in a way that is not good for anybody. And, you know, but of course, how to deal with it is a really complex matter. And one thing you don't want to do is to reinforce a misperception that all ethnic Chinese living in other countries are spies for the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party.
A question from Tom Bruce, PhD in our department. So at the end of the presentation, you argue that China relations shouldn't be dominated by security concerns. How the past has increasingly demonstrated how interconnected and globalized networks can be used coercively by their interests. Is it possible then to pursue more selective with the PRC while reducing vulnerability in the China dependent and domestic?
You know, I think the effort that the United States and other Western countries are undertaking to find replacement supply chains to replace their interdependence with China in many sectors across really many areas, including biotech and medical things, I think is going to be incredibly costly to everybody. It's going to, and I don't think it can work. I think trying to prevent the spread of scientific knowledge throughout the world is extremely difficult. And in the end, it will be self-defeating. So, you know, I think a lot depends on how we define our objectives here. If we're trying to just slow down China's progress, contain China's rise in order to maintain American primacy, that's the wrong goal, in my opinion. We should be trying to induce moderation in Chinese policy choices and try to influence China's trajectory and show China's leaders and its public that we understand and respect China's ambitions to be a leading global power. And we believe it can do that in a positive and constructive manner. You don't need to intimidate and coerce other countries to do that. But it's true that defending against, especially this kind of economic coercion, is very, very difficult. I mean, how do we defend Australia or Korea or Canada when China puts unreasonable sanctions on them? You know, do we just retaliate, tit for tat? Do we find other markets, other sources? It's a very difficult problem.
Question from Ellen. American fund manager and longtime China watcher Kyle Bass has predicted that the US and China will be at war with each other within 2 years. Would you care to comment?
Well, I sure hope he's wrong. I don't believe that. I believe we have more time to work this problem. Overreaching on the Chinese side and overreaction on the US side creates a downward spiral, which is definitely dangerous. But I have more confidence in our ability to think through the problem, adjust our own policies, and, you know, hopefully there may be some moderation, some adjustment in Xi's third term as well.
Sure. And a question for Charlotte. What is your opinion on the future of Taiwan in Xi Jinping's view, and is there a timeline?
Well, Xi Jinping has not articulated a timeline for reunification, but many people in China who I've talked to believe that one of the main justifications for a third term is to solve the Taiwan issue during his third term. So I'm not sure how patient Xi Jinping is. And I have to say that I was really disturbed by the recent white paper on Taiwan, which omitted a promise to the Taiwan people that under the one country, two systems peaceful reunification, the PRC would not base military forces or government administrative personnel in Taiwan. They dropped that. Well, why is that important? Well, to me, that means that Xi Jinping is closing the door to peaceful reunification. Whereas just under Hu Jintao, we saw a very active policy to pursue peaceful reunification through economic integration, exchange of students, tourists, more social integration between the two sides, and trying to kind of win the hearts and minds and trust of the people of Taiwan. So I would feel a lot better if Xi Jinping were trying to do that rather than making a bet on coercion and use of force.
We have about 2 minutes left. You know, this is a pessimistic note to end our webinar, but I think that is probably, you know, the direction of U.S.-China relations and China's relations with the rest of the world more broadly. Please join me in thanking Susan for this really illuminating talk, and all the best with your book sale.
Well, thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing people's reactions when they read the book.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, Lynette. Great discussion.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.